Okay, welcome everyone to this session. Today we have a great pleasure of having a new version of this webinar series with two great speakers. We are on our fourth webinar organized by the Pan American Society of Transport Association, Research Association. And we have the pleasure of having Juan de Dios Ortúzar and Cara Kokelman as speaker. And I'm very pleased to be moderating this session, this hour and a half, that we will be sharing some interesting presentation from Juan de Dios and Cara on engagement, institutional belief, and multiple choice heuristics in willingness to pay estimation and long-distance travel impacts of AVs and A-traps. We will start with our first presenter, which is who is Juan de Dios Ortúzar. I'm going to read a short bio of Juan de Dios, and certainly I'm going to fall short to do this short presentation, this short introduction of Juan de Dios, because he has so many things to share. But I will try my best. Juan de Dios is an emeritus professor of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and he's a very well-known researcher in transport modeling, and he's a world reference and pioneer in discrete choice modeling, transport planning, valuation of externalities, and survey design. He is a co-author of the book Modeling Transport, and he has authored more than 200 scientific articles in very prestigious academic journals. He was also the co-editor-in-chief of TRA, Transportation Research Part A, Policy and Practice. And he, in addition, is a member of the editorial board of several of the most reputable journals in the field of transport. He received a Doctor Honoris Causa from Universidad de Cantabria in Spain back in 2018. The Life Achievement Award by the International Association for Travel Behavior Research in 2012, and the Humboldt Research Award by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in 2010. Also, Professor Ortúzar has formed several generations of professionals and specialists in the field of transportation, with a profound service vocation, forming more than 18 PhD students and 50 master students, including me, who work in academia, government, and professional practice in Chile, Latin America, and Europe. He's like recognized like one of the fathers of the Latin American specialists in transportation. So Juan de Dios I'm very pleased to make this presentation and to be in this webinar. So please welcome, and you will have like 20 to 25 minutes for the presentation, and then we will have a space for questions from the audience. So welcome, Juan de Dios.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thanks everybody for being here. We decided that it was better to do the presentation in English because there would be maybe people from very different countries, and in Spanish could be some less available. So Cara and I will do it in English. Okay, I'm going to talk about this title here, which looks very nice and promising. It is a title that comes from the part of the PhD thesis of Jose Javier Soto, which is another Colombian student, and is going to be my last PhD, I think. We are supervising him together with Dr. Luis Risi here at the Catholic University of Chile. And he produced already a paper, which is the one I'm going to talk about today. And the presentation will have these 4 elements: an introduction, theoretical background for some of you that may not be aware of some of the things, our methodology and results, and finally some implications. And actually, it's not true what I'm saying here, because the implications and conclusions I'm not going to be presented because I decided that it was too long. So this was before I finished my presentation, actually. Okay, so in terms of an introduction, everybody knows that when you want to appraise a project, you require to monetize some of the potential costs and benefits, but many of these benefits are very hard to value because they, for example, may be non-market goods or lack observable prices. In the case of transportation, a very good example of this type of benefits are in the case of accident risk reductions or air quality improvements. And we have done some work in all these areas before. We will consider in this paper, in this presentation, the benefits of mortality reductions due to road safety, together with air quality improvements, using what I would call now the dominant stated choice approach. And why I say dominant, because some people in certain other fields are still using contingent valuation. And I think that stated choice clearly dominates contingent valuation. However, even though it is a very good approach, it still has some challenges that need to be considered. Otherwise, we might get a biased response. And I will show you here that by not considering something that we had not considered before, we actually get a bias in the response. And the bias may be caused by the following things. First of all, the survey, as we all know, has a hypothetical nature, and it may not be correctly understood by the respondents of the non-market good. There are certain things here that we have experienced through time. Like, for example, if people don't understand the phrasing of the experiment, they may think of something else and answer truthfully, but something different to what we want. Or maybe they consider the experiment non-realistic and they will answer again, not sincerely. And also there is a potential for a strategic behavior. And in this case, the responses may not reveal the actual preferences of the people, but something else. And this could happen, for example, when there is what we call here deep institutional distrust. For example, that people may not believe that, for example, the government would be capable of implementing a certain product that we are putting forward in the experiment. And this is precisely what we want to talk in this particular example. And this, as I said before, may lead to biased responses towards what we call the status quo alternative. We typically design experiments comparing a status quo alternative with other new alternatives. And this may lead to either protest responses, and these protest responses may be considered incorrectly by us as lexicographic rather than choosing trading off the attributes of the experiment. So these things are very important, and we had not really considered them before in the depth I'm going to present now. Okay, in addition, the usual assumption in random utility models, which are the typical model that we are employing here, is that everybody will consider all the information and always choose the option with the highest utility, the typical Homo economicus assumption. But this is especially in cases where it's more difficult to answer. For example, you have too many alternatives or you have too many attributes. This may demand a high cognitive effort, and so people may resort in those cases to other choice heuristics. For example, they may do satisficing or elimination by aspects, depending on the trade-off between cognitive effort and accuracy. There is a very good paper by Payne et al. That discusses this in great depth. We have done some work on this also, and it's quite interesting to see that people actually do change their behavior in terms of choosing when they are confronted with different types of experiments. Now, there is also another issue that has not been considered too much, which is the engagement that people have when responding to the task. And this involves the willingness to complete the experiments correctly. And in that sense, we would observe that motivated respondents should yield more reliable choices. On the other hand, when you have a higher engagement and actually take more seriously the task of answering correctly, it inevitably means that you will have a higher response time because you're going to do a more detailed review of the choice situations. Finally, as I said before, individuals might use different choice heuristics when attempting to answer a very complex.
Sin el OR, pregunto.
Sorry? Okay, if this is not considered, we could get, again, bias estimates. I'm not sure if Laura was asking me something or whether it was an unintended.
No, she was unmuted, so
Okay, right. Okay.
Proceed.
Okay, now determining whether all this is happening is not trivial because we could ask people to make a retrospective self-report about the mental processes that we're using when choosing, but this can be unreliable because people may forget what they were doing it really, or we have used also think aloud reporting, like in this paper by Dan Studley and others, but this is not very feasible if you have a large sample because it demands a lot of work afterwards in processing. So here we are going to provide a general framework to estimate the willingness to pay for reducing this risk and estimate eventually the value of a statistical life, considering the potential presence in the survey of several choice heuristics and incorporating both these items I was mentioning before that we will call survey engagement and institutional beliefs through latent variables. And this is I think, very interesting because I will show to you that in this particular case, this will lead to if we don't take into account these considerations, the willingness to pay that we obtain.
Como que vi tantos mensajes y me alerté.
Sorry, Luz Mary?
Bueno, de nada, bueno.
No, sorry, it's just unlucky. Okay, well, in terms of modeling, we are going to allow people to use different heuristics. In this particular presentation, we will consider only two: the possibility that they are random utility maximizers or the possibility that they use ANA, attribute not attendance. In the case of compensatory behavior, like room, we may have a multinomial logit model or a mixed logit model. And I just mentioned here the probability of choosing an option I by individual Q as a function of the utility, observed utility BIQ. And in this case, we have a scale factor lambda, which typically we cannot estimate. So we have to consider it equal to 1. And in the case of a more interesting situation where we can have a mixed logit model, we would have this kind of an equation, but we would have to integrate around the values of the parameters which we assume are considered, for example, random among the individuals, or we may add an error component to consider the correlation of the different choices when we are using, for example, stated choice data, like here. And the second heuristic we will consider in this particular exercise, attribute not attendance, where individuals only consider a subset of the attributes presented in the choice experiments, and Camila Van Moltien and David Kencher have studied this in great depth. Our survey did not ask respondents to state if they have examined all the attributes. We can do that sometimes. In this particular one, we didn't. So we inferred the attribute not attendance using the latent class approach. And in this particular case, each class represented a group of respondents that attended to a different subset of attributes. And the parameters of the attributes that were ignored by the respondents were set to 0, and probabilities within the ANA class were calculated using the usual multinomial logic formula above, considering only the non-ignored subsets of attributes. So that explains why the results are going to be different when we compare those of the two classes. Now, when we deal simultaneously with multiple choice heuristics, the most common approach is to use a latent class model with a two-level structure. And I recommend you to look at the paper by Gonzalez, Valdez, et al., as it's very interesting in this particular sense. Here, the probability that the respondent Q chooses alternative I is given by this slightly more complex formula where we have a summation over the heuristics K of the probability IQK of choosing I under choice heuristic K and multiply by the probability of choosing heuristic K given certain parameters beta K and tau K that are to be estimated in the model, okay? We know, on the other hand, that attitudes and perceptions are not very easy to account for, and they may influence choice if we incorporate them as latent variables. And probably all of you know that to incorporate latent variables in a hybrid choice model, we typically use a mimic model, like, for example, Bahamon de Birke et al. Have explained in great depth. Here we will have structural equations where the latent variables are explained by the characteristics of the respondent and the phenomenon under study, and we'll also have measurement equations where the latent variables explain the response to the various perception indicators that we have designed for the individuals also to answer. Now, in this particular case, we wanted to determine two distinct willingness to pay, one for crash-related deaths and another for cardiorespiratory death caused by air pollution. And there was a survey that was taken by Luis Risi, being the director of that for our government some couple of years ago. And as the risk of death probabilities are very small because they are the number of deaths over the total reference population, people tend to get confused if you present probabilities. So understanding risk figures in that sense can be very challenging. So we use here the same idea that Risi during his PhD had proposed, to use the actual number of deaths for our two particular causes as the risk attribute. And in our latent class framework, we need to calculate then the willingness to pay, considering the various heuristics and the respondents' average probabilities of invoking each of these. And the total WTP will be then computed by weighting the willingness to pay for each heuristic by the probability of invoking it, what we call mu. And therefore, we will get something like the final willingness to pay for individual Q is the probability of selecting the room heuristic times the value of the willingness to pay in that case, plus the other one, okay? So that is more or less what we did in this exercise. And the averaging can be done in this particular case very easily because ANA is a restricted version of room. And you have to note here that cost is the only attribute that cannot be unattended because this would lead to an unbounded WTP. Luckily, it was not the case. Now, several information, we use a sample of over 1,000 regular residents of Santiago. The response rate was 77%. The survey had three main components: an SC experiment comprising a set of 9 choice scenarios, a set of perception indicators that were qualified using the typical 5-point Likert scale, social demographic attributes of the respondent, the household, and the head of the household, if she was not the person that answered the survey. And our framework allows to estimate, as I said before, simultaneously the willingness to pay to reduce the traffic mortality risk and to reduce the risk of dying from cardiorespiratory disease due to air pollution in 2 instances, as I will mention in a minute. The respondents were first shown a set of cards to acquaint themselves with the number of deaths per year attributed to our 2 causes of death according to their age group, so that they knew what was the kind of general situation, and then they were changed the numbers in the experiment, okay? They were also shown a set of potential measures to mitigate both types of mortality risk. In the case of traffic accidents, the measures included improving the road design, tightening the process for getting a driver's license, which, for example, in my country is not very tight, and generating educational plans for both drivers and pedestrians. In the case of air pollution, the measures included a stricter regulation of industrial processes, establishing limitations to the use of polluting vehicles, providing incentives for less polluting technologies, etc. And the experimental design differed according to the age of the respondents. So we have one for people between 25 and 44, another one for 45 to 64, another one for over 65. And in each case, the respondents were asked to face 9 hypothetical choice scenarios and choose among 3 alternatives: the current situation, the status quo, Program A and Program B, which were 2 different programs where we presented these different measures, and I will show you a little table about it. Here, as you can see, in all cases, the attributes were the number of deaths by traffic accidents, the number of deaths due to air pollution, the future deaths that would be produced for having air pollution nowadays, and the cost in Chilean pesos per month for each of the 3 age levels, and the levels were for the programs where status quo had these levels, for example, 200 deaths by air pollution, etc. And in each program, we would have differences in this number of deaths, etc. And they were reducing the previous one because they were something that was done by the government. Okay, that was the idea. Just for you to have an idea of what is the meaning of these values of the money, at the time of the survey, our rate of exchange was that $1 was 600 Chilean pesos. Okay. Right. Sorry, and right. And this is more or less how the hypothetical cards look in the experiment. You see, you had the current situation, status quo, Program A, Program B, and you would have traffic accidents explained here, people of your age group who will die each year due to traffic accidents until you reach 65. So there will be 200, 190, 170, and we explain here that was a reduction of 5% or 15%, etc. And then the same thing for the cardiorespiratory diseases due to air pollution. And this one, which was a little more interesting, cardiorespiratory diseases due to air pollution for people of 60 years old or more when you reach 65 years old, due to the presence of the current pollution, okay? And finally, the monthly cost of each of these programs that you have to pay permanently in the future. So if people would like to have these reductions, they would have to pay permanently this amount of money, as it was going to change in each of the 9 choice scenarios, okay? So as a brief summary, this is the distribution of respondents by choice. Here we have the age group, and here we have the number of respondents. And things that you can notice here is that, for example, 64.9 people choose only programs A or B, never the status quo. So these guys are safety concerned respondents. They would always be prepared to pay a monthly cost to reduce the mortality risk of any kind. And on the other hand, you have 14.4 that always choose the status quo. So these people, these people actually, this is in general, they increase with age. So the younger guys are less concerned than the older guys. So the older guys choose more the status quo. In a sense, I will talk about this later. This means that they have probably less trust in the government being capable of implementing the measures that we are discussing. When we see the responses to the indicators that we had put into the survey, we had a latent variable engagement. Remember, that was this ability to be really answering correctly and with great care. And we had 3 levels here: attention level, comprehension, and cooperation level. And these were measured by the survey personnel. And in the case of institutional belief, we asked the people to say whether they believe that the government would be true to their word in implementing this accident risk mitigation or this pollution risk mitigation. And as you can see, in the case of engagement, both the attention level, comprehension, and cooperation level, we had, because 1 and 2 are the people that answer, I don't believe at all, I don't believe a little, I'm neutral, I do believe at all, right? We have here around 10 to 13% of people that were qualified by our survey attendants as people that were not engaging deeply in their task, okay? And on the other hand, in terms of institutional belief, we see that about 15% of respondents doubted that the government would be capable of implementing one of the programs for reducing traffic risk or environmental pollution. So, but the majority were believing. Okay, now, in the proposed model that we had, each class represents a choice heuristic, and a class membership is a function of a class-specific constant, the latent variable engagement, and the respondent's socioeconomic characteristics. For identifiability, one of the class constant was set to 0, the variable engagement was only estimated for the room class, and we made the hypothesis that respondents using the compensatory approach, room, would be more engaged with the survey because their choice was more complex. In the choice model, we consider the effect of the 4 design attributes, the program monthly cost, the number of traffic accident fatalities, the number of pollution-related fatalities, and the number of future fatalities caused by pollution, the latent variable institutional belief, which did not appear in the status quo utility, an error component to consider the potential correlation among the responses of each individual, that is what we call the pseudo-panel effect, and finally, an error component to consider the potential correlation between program A and program B, because both programs were perceived as more similar alternatives as opposed to the status quo. And here are the results, and I'm going to finish. I hope I'm not passing my time too much. The results of the estimation of the model for the 2 classes, right? As you can see in the latent class room, we have these 4 attributes with consistent signs and also very significant. And we can see that the traffic-related mortality is perceived as more affecting the utility more than the number of the air pollution risk, and much more also than the pollution, the deaths for air pollution in the future, right? So that is something interesting that we were not probably secure we would get at all. In the case of the pseudo-panel effect, as you can see, in both cases is significant, and it's saying that the correlation among respondent choices is relevant, and also that there is a correlation here between both programs that is also significant. Okay, so we have, in the 2 cases, we have that is important to include these error components. And in relation to the engagement variable and the institutional belief variable, we can see that both, again, are significant and positive. This means that people with more trust in the government's ability are more likely to choose this thing. And the engagement being greater than 0, again, confirms the hypothesis that people with more engagement are more likely to choose the room alternative. And you can see that in general, more or less 72% of the people would be aware of the type trading off all the attributes, and only 28% aware of the type ANA. In the case of ANA, the only attribute considered was the cost, and we also had an important alternative specific constant. Okay, now these are the results, and with this I'm going to and in terms of the class membership here, we also have that to belong to the room class, it was preferred by high-income people, but not so by people older than 65 and by students, right? Okay, now Finally, willingness to pay estimation and value of statistical life. And this is where I show the importance of this model in comparison to one that doesn't consider these issues. In Santiago, according to the last census that was in 2017, we have over 1.64 million people between 25 and 44, over 1.24 million between 45 and 64, and 607,000 over 65. So to estimate the value of statistical life for traffic accidents and air pollution, we use the total population over 25, which are roughly 3.5 million. But in the case of the willingness to pay for future air pollution fatalities, we use the population between 25 and 64, as that attribute was not presented to the oldest group. And these are the results. And look at these results because they're quite interesting. We compare our hybrid choice model, including all these latent variables, with a more classical mixed logic model without the latent variables, which is the one that you would estimate if you don't believe that engagement and for example, this idea of believing in the government's ability, etc., are important. And as you can see, we get a willingness to pay of and a value of statistical life, which are, in the case of our better model, 26% less than the other value. In the case of the air pollution, 6.4% less, and in the case of future air pollution, 23% less. So these are quite important values of a variability, because you may, if you're using this willingness to pay to, for example, decide whether you implement or not a certain policy, having a value that is actually 26% less maybe will tell you not to do the policy in comparison to what would you get when you apply a model which is not so well done. So this would be, I think, my last transparency. And if anybody wants, this presentation will be there and for you to look at afterwards. These are the references that I used, that I quoted during the presentation. And I'm really sorry if I overstep my time, Julian. This is it.
Don't worry, Juan de Dios. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. So we have space for some questions. I think we have about 10 minutes space for questions from the audience. You can just place your questions in the chat box, or just raise your hand, your virtual hand, and you can do it in Spanish or in English. So just to break the ice, I will make some questions regarding this presentation. And the first one is, I'm just wondering if when you estimated the effect of the future deaths, did you consider if people discount this effect over time because they are going to experience or to have or give less valuation to that in the future? So yeah. The first one will be that. I will place a second one, and is that if you measure the effect of having 9 choice situations, and if those choice situations influence maybe the engagement with the experiment that presented to the respondent. Yeah, just to start with those 2 questions, Juan de Dios.
Okay, thank you very much, Julian. The first question is actually very relevant, and the answer is no. We didn't do that, and we believe that that is something that we could do better, because we considered that the problem was already too complicated. I mean, we were doing a latent class model with these latent variables and mixtures, and so it was really very hard. So we didn't consider this, but we had a little note. That's very interesting, because we had a little note in the paper that is published here, as you can see oh, I didn't put it here. Put it in the first one. It's published in Accident Analysis and Prevention, and we put a little note precisely on this issue, that we understand that we did it very simply here, but not considering that people could for example, discount as you mentioned. So that is a very good question. The second one, I didn't understand it very well, Julian. What do you mean? I'm not sure what you want to know.
If the number of choice situations presented to the respondents could have an effect on the survey engagement of the respondents.
Yes, sure. I mean, that's yes. We didn't consider this either in this particular case. We were just studying the number of attributes, if you want, and the changes in the attributes, rather than the number of alternatives or the number of situations. We have done a study before on the importance of the number of situations. You may recall the famous Cosad et al. Paper. And interestingly, again, Javier Soto is going to do a very complicated model for a survey that he prepared, where one of the things that we will do is precisely to, again, try to think whether the scale factor that is associated with these mixed or multinomial logic models is affected by the fact that we have more or less choice situations.
Okay, great. We have a question from Cara in the chat box. I will read the question. So, or Cara, if you prefer, you can just, okay. I will read them. Why were the eldest respondents not presented with the BSL question? Or what was the willingness to pay question was asked in regards to older people having shorter lives?
Sorry.
You can go to the chat box if you prefer, Juan de Dios.
No, let me just show Cara
Okay.
again. This is the survey, Cara. And can you maybe ask on the basis of this figure, what would you like to know?
Well, in one of your very last slides, you said this was not asked of the older population, 65 plus, I think. So this was only inferred for the age 25 to 55. And I wasn't sure if the older people didn't get the same survey or everybody was asked to say
No.
people in the middle.
The older people didn't get the last question. This one.
And you didn't want them to get that question because?
No,
what?
because they were already 65. So the question was about people now when they were going to be 65.
Oh, it sounds to me like you're just asking about other people who are 65. So to take themselves out of the equation, not themselves trying to save themselves, but yeah.
The idea of this question was, you are now 25 or 44 or whatever, right? When you are 65, people that of your age now will be dying in this proportion. And that was not asked to the people of already 65.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. And then there was also a question, well, not a question, but I noticed that we have a very high VSL according to our U.S. Department of Transportation, but I don't think the state DOTs use that when they do their benefit cost analysis. So I was wondering if that's similar in Chile or other nations. Anybody's welcome to chip into the chat box there.
Yes, you are totally right. And this is sad because this willingness to pay and BSL here, for example, $4 million per death or whatever, right? No, I mean, since the time of Luis Risi's PhD, we have found that the value of a statistical life should be a lot higher than the one we have now. But even our government has not implemented those, and they're still relying on kind of old-fashioned values that are a lot less than that. I don't know what happens in Colombia or elsewhere.
Just so everybody knows, I am told, I'm a transportation economist, supposedly, and I am told that the values of life don't come from surveys like this, but they come often from jury awards. And of course, the cost of crashes comes from lots of economic as well as pain and suffering or non-economic comprehensive costs here in this country. And so there's a lot of numbers flying around, and I don't think the engineers who are doing safety improvements really know any of the literature at all. So they're pretty confused. But we can all just place a value on our spouse, on our kid, on our neighbor's kid, and on somebody across the country, pretty easily if we're asked, I think. But it's jury awards in trials, I think, that really end up giving us a value. Like, what did they think, all these 12 jurors discussing this matter?
Yes. Now, this is actually the way to do it properly, in my opinion, has been there available since the 1990s with the work of a guy called Jones Lee in England. And he actually changed completely the way that these things were done. But he was still using contingent evaluation, and his results were kind of suspect for that. And then when Risi came in with his method, with the thing improved completely, and now it's been applied in Australia, in Germany, in Spain, in Norway, and it works very well.
Yeah, as we have space for a last question, I will take that time to do a final question, Juan de Dios.
Yes.
And just taking advance that that you have this slide. How did you compute the engagement in this real case application for the hybrid choice model? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, the engagement was a latent variable that had these 3 indicators, and the people answered. In the case of engagement, let me just try to remember very well. The attention level, I think.
For the forecasting, about the forecasting in the.
What?
But the forecasting exercise that you.
You're not talking about how do we measure this?
No. How did you compute it in the real case scenario that you
But in the real case scenario, I mean, here is the value of the variable engagement. Okay?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. But you applied in the forecasting.
No, but in the forecasting, I didn't do a forecasting. I did do a calculation of the willingness to pay.
Yeah. Okay. Just okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we are on time. Thank you, Juan de Dios, for this presentation and for sharing your insights on this topic. And we will move to our second presenter of this webinar, who is Kara Kokelman. I'm going to also give a brief presentation of Kara, but I will fall short as well, like with Juan de Dios. Kara is the DeWitt Center Centennial Professor in Engineering in the University of Texas at Austin. Her work focuses on transportation engineering and includes planning for future implementation of shared and autonomous vehicle systems and policies like credit-based congestion pricing and urban growth boundaries. She's a co-author of more than 200 scientific articles and is an expert in transportation and emerging technologies, focusing on city infrastructure and automated vehicles. Kara's works focus on finding the best technology in the transportation sector using modeling to predict how new vehicles technology could affect society in the future. In 2020, she received ASCE's Bechtel Energy Award for her energy and emissions-focused research and the Bullock Top 20 in 2020 Award for Women in Smart Mobility. She also served as the president of the North American Regional Science Council and became a fellow of the Regional Science Association International in 2021. In 2022, she received the Wimmer School Faculty Fellow Award in Urban Economics from the Homer Hyde Institute. Cara also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the rural and Andean region of Ecuador. So, Cara, welcome and very pleased to have you here.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Es un placer estar con ustedes y disculpará que yo también vaya a hablar en puro inglés, yo creo, o a veces tal vez un poco de español. Es el mejor idioma del mundo, definitivamente, y ya, es una tristeza que no todos hablamos el mismo idioma, este idioma. But I'm for staying on time, I'm going to shift to English, but you're welcome to try and ask questions in Spanish. I'll see if I can decipher at the end, or Alberto or Julian can do that for me. So there's a lot of co-authors on this particular paper. I put a link to the URL of a preprint in the chat box, and there are other papers like it that I'll mention early on in the presentation, and more coming, but I really like this paper. This one is really focused on passenger travel, but of course we do have papers on freight and how that's being impacted. The one that I think will be of greatest interest to you is with Yan Tao, and so I'm just gonna, so if you look at my webpage, this guy also has a paper on freight for the US, which came a little bit later, I think, than this particular paper. But we have several, and there's a lot of people involved. And in those past papers, for example, my paper with Jeff Lamondia, who does a lot of long distance passenger travel work, we estimated that about 25% of airline passenger trips under 500 miles would shift to autonomous vehicles. And when Yan Tao did that work just for Texas, I mean, it was much bigger. It was like an 85% shift away from for the Texas market. So that'd be like Houston to Austin, or Houston to Dallas, Dallas to San Antonio, Corpus Christi. So origins and destinations within the big state of Texas, which is the nation's second biggest state after Alaska. We saw a real devastation or loss. But of course, airline travel is highly global warming. When you emit a ton of carbon at elevation, it's twice as bad as emitting it here on the ground. So if you're just going to calculate tons of carbon, you really need to multiply that. And in some settings, it's a multiple of 3. So it's really quite bad. So it's not bad to lose airline travel. We really have too much. You can see that the airline industry is under a lot of stress. They're missing pilots and things like that. So it would be nice if we're really going to get to net zero. Of course, we need to stop traveling so much. So also put in the chat box a link for you to sign up for our carbon-free conference called Bridging Transportation Researchers. And I think we've presented that work and this paper in the past at the BTR conference. We've focused on sharing rides. So if you can fill, an all-electric vehicle or maybe a Prius, which is pretty high fuel economy, you can do so much better and still, partake in long-distance travel without having to drive. Because that is a big burden. And I'm sure Juan de Dios has lots of value of time, estimates from his many years in this field. Depending on how much these vehicles cost, we do expect, the technology costs more because it's going to save you from having to drive, but eventually it will probably be required. I think it will bring crashes down enough that it will be required to let the vehicle do the driving. But, some of our work suggests that U.S. airline across the nation would fall dramatically as well, which I don't think is a bad thing. But the aircraft, Africa, India, all these other places are flying. They can have those airplanes. I don't, but ideally we would shift to different fuels and sources of energy for air travel, which is difficult with batteries because of the weight. So, in the Texas Triangle, we also have another paper. This is Yan Tao Huang's, looking both at passenger and freight, and a big increase in vehicle miles traveled, or in all the countries that, almost all the countries you guys are in today, the vehicle kilometers traveled. So VKT would potentially jump, but here in Texas, and our mega region is Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio. So Austin is included in that triangle, basically. And then finally, I think Pat Mokhtarin with one of her students did a survey just of Georgian adults, and she is an excellent survey designer and analyst, and she estimated that more than half of the adults were thinking that they would probably end up making more leisure and long distance trips with further destinations, further ground destinations. So I think airlines will lose out, but you will see much more congestion on the roadway network, because we're making driving easier, right? You can read, you can sleep, and hopefully reducing the travel, the cost of crashes and the frequency and severity of those. In this work, I'm just going to be talking about trips that are over 75 miles one way. Some people draw the line at 50 miles, which is about 80 kilometers. Some people draw it at 100 miles to be classified as a long distance trip. And of course, distance is a continuum. So really, some of the 60-mile trips are going to become 80-mile trips. And, you know, depending on how you slice and dice this, you know, you want to allow for that shift. So normally when we simulate everything, but I think in this particular paper, we were really focused on this type of travel. So over 75 miles, and looking forward in a future where there are, you know, autonomous vehicles easily available no matter where you are. You may have bought one and you have it in your driveway, or you can rent a shared one. Maybe you have to drive. If you're in a very rural location, you might drive to like a bus stop and get on a self-driving bus with a lot of people to do a longer distance trip, or, you know, pay for maybe an extra fee for it to come out to your farm if you're in a very rural location, because there's a lot of deadheading or empty travel in those settings. And of course, these things don't exist. So just like Juan de Dios did, we did our own survey, and LD stands for long distance. AV is for a fully automated or autonomous vehicle. And we always try to have sample sizes of about 1,000. We make sure they're well balanced, but we also then correct them. And we combine them with other data because there's not a lot of long distance trips in the National Household Travel Survey, which is much bigger than our survey. And in our survey, we were asking people to recall, which is difficult, especially once COVID began. That was really, you know, difficult to recall like a year or two before how they were traveling. And I can't remember the date of this survey, but I think it was right at the start of the pandemic. And so we were asking people to recall a travel, you know, a year before that. And there is an FHWA, which is the Federal Highway Administration within the U.S. Department of Transportation. There is a data set that RSG, which is a top-notch consulting firm, created for them to try to micro synthesize these tours with number of people, which types of people. And they also came up to do that. They had to come up with travel times and costs between like every OD payer in the U.S. And I think they used just 200 or maybe 400 zones. So it wasn't as detailed as we normally would like, but it was better than anything that had been done before that. We combined that with the 2016-2017 National Household Travel Survey. Lots of people, but just a one-day survey, not really retrospective memories of past long-distance travel. And so we only caught about 16,000 long-distance trips there on that day. And then we expanded it to the nation, you know, recognizing demographic details across zones. So you have older people sometimes in rural areas, younger people in urban areas. And at the end of that, we ended up with about 20 long distance trips per American per year. And they don't survey those under 4. They don't even ask the parents for data on those kids. So I'm not really sure what they're doing, but they're usually following the parents around. So yeah, they may be making quite a few long distance trips themselves, but they're not really making that decision. They're just following. There's an EPA SMART location data set. So that's the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States, which is really nice. They have walk scores. So these are the kind of micro-synthetic scores based on access walking from your address. And so they did that for everybody in the survey, but we also can tie our own surveys to this SMART location data set. So the National Household Travel Survey it knows where its respondents live, and they are adding that. And we can add it at a slightly less specific level in our own surveys. And we have a past vehicle ownership model based on our own surveys of willingness to buy and use autonomous vehicles. So we have that up front in the simulations I'm going to show you. And of course, we know where a lot of people live, and the microdata sample means we know exactly the features of the household, but we don't know exactly what zone she lives in or that household lives in. It's across sort of like a small city, and so we have to map these individual households from the census into census tracts, which are like neighborhoods. And then for the trade details, we're looking at transaction tables between different industries, I think 14 different industries, and how they buy and sell from one another. And so I also do a lot of regional science work. And so this comes to us from a courtesy of our friends in regional science, typically. For the freight interactions, when you buy inputs to your own production process and then you sell them to other industries or to final clients who are using them, final users. Our synthetic population is based on a lot of those data sets and improved software, and we've provided it freely. At the bottom of my webpage, there is a 10% sample of the whole US at the census tract level, which is really detailed. So hopefully you don't have to go through all this work yourself, although it is for 2019 or 2020, I can't remember exactly. So forgive us that it's not, you know, the latest and greatest based on the continuing American Community Survey data. But you can see just based on densities, you know, where people live in this country. There's a lot of rural area. It's a big nation. And that 10% sample is across all of the census tracts in the US that have any housing whatsoever. And I encourage you to use that if you ever need a synthetic population for some place in the US. Our models of these households and what they own, and over time, how they let go of vehicles and maybe add an autonomous vehicle or let go of a vehicle and don't replace it, just start using shared autonomous vehicles. Those are some of the behaviors, as well as, of course, mode and destination choices once you have access to these new kinds of vehicles. And I'm going to show you some of the model results, like vehicle ownership. You got to have that up front, and we're resimulating that every year for every one of these microsynthetic households to see how they evolve over time, because vehicles are very long-lived assets. They average, before scrappage, about 17 years in this country. And of course, if you take good care of them or they don't crash, I bet the average would be closer to 20 years. And a lot can happen with technology in 20 years. So it takes a really long time to electrify our fleet and then to shift to an autonomous fleet, as you can imagine. So we move forward about 20 years, assuming that AVs are available now. And I think the prices are falling over time, but they're quite expensive right now. And then they fall, I forget, maybe 4% a year, which is typical of a lot of new technologies, like phone prices and stuff for the same kind of phone would fall at about that rate. And so we're combining data sets depending on what was asked to be able to move these households through time across the nation. So every household, every location is different based on land use. And over time, we're keeping track of the vehicles owned. Just so you know, the number of vehicles right now is very much a function of the number of those with driver's licenses and the income household, as well as the population density that they live in. And these bars that you can see on this chart, you know, the more drivers, the more positive. And if you change that variable by 1 standard deviation from the data set, you can see how many drivers are in each of these households, maybe 1,000 different households. And if you increase this guy by 1 standard deviation, you increase the Y variable by about 50% of its standard deviation, so about half of its standard deviation. And we call that practical significance, and I highly recommend it. It's much better than just giving a p-value for a coefficient, but actually using the model and one at a time, changing every household or observational unit in that model by 1 standard deviation upwards on income or drivers, or changing everybody from male and female to just female, something like that. But really 1 standard deviation kind of makes it equitable. And so you can really see who are the standouts, like drivers, as well as this other variable, which is the natural log of population density, because I guess it performed better than strict population density. And so that had about a negative 27% reduction in one standard deviation of the vehicles owned per household in the data set when we increased that variable, which was a log transformation by one standard deviation. And then there's the trip frequencies. You got to know how many people, are in the household. We synthesize that, and then how many vehicles they might own in every year, and let go of vehicles over time. And then we also do a trip frequency. And since these are long distance trips, most people do not travel more than 75 miles on a single day, one way or two way, but about 3% do it. And then another 2% do go out and back, or they chain a couple long distance tours, and hardly anybody would be making 3 or more. And in this case, because it's such a preponderance of zeros, we used a zero inflated negative binomial, but we did try some others. And here we're using the National Household Travel Survey because they have a lot more data on these long distance trips than you would normally get, because it's a 264,000 person sample. One day sample, but still they were able to capture quite a few. And just to give you a sense of the results, the number of vehicles owned is a big predictor. So it's much easier for those with a lot of vehicles. That's actually the biggie you can see here. So one standard deviation change in that variable throughout the data set raised the number of long distance trips by about 65% of one standard deviation in that long distance trip variable for the person. This is at the person level. So we're controlling for gender and age and whether they work. And of course, workers are very busy getting to work. So a day of week also has a big impact. I'm sorry it's not showing here, but it is important. Weekends you typically have more long distance travel, and income, of course, pushing it up. But interestingly, number of adults in the household pushing it down. So if I live in a household with a lot of adults, you know everything about me, if I'm an adult. And if there are other adults in the household, they actually hold me back. So that's a little interesting. But there is a positive correlation. So a little bit of multicollinearity between these two variables. Party size is important because if you're going to fly on these long distance trips, maybe a 400-mile or more long distance trip, you have to buy a ticket for everybody. Whereas if you drive, you just throw people in the trunk, I don't know, put them on the roof like Mitt Romney did with his dog. So you can add people really cheaply, especially if they're a dog and they don't have a voice in their mode. And yeah, we used a negative binomial here, which starts with a 0. So we let the zeros be the one person trips. And so this is really, are you going to add somebody? Is there another person or 2 or 3 on your trip with you? And females tend to travel a bit more with other people, and commuters tend to travel less often with other people. So you can see that. And a lot of people think, in the United States, there's just one person in the car all the time. But because the long distance trips have, they're expensive to make, you usually try to find somebody who wants to go with you. And so you end up on average, maybe 2 persons. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Party size is definitely affected by distance and type of trip. So, visiting friends or relatives, normally you would think that's kind of positive, but for leisure, so there's another trip category here, or 2 or 3 that I'm not showing, but those would be the reference case, and those will lead to, higher occupancy. But you can have long distance work trips, and, so there's commute directly to your job or office, and then there's other types of work trips. And so we were just trying to match them with our simulations, and we didn't do so well on some of these variables, like personal business. This is just to give you a sense of how we were keeping track of who was doing what in the data set, this National Household Travel Survey, and then the synthetic population that we were running through a complex model. And a lot of the long distance trips do occur in summer, just so you have a sense, fewer in winter, but they are occurring throughout the year. And some of our latest models are day by day. We are looking at long distance travel on Thanksgiving versus Christmas and the days before and after and all of that. So you can see evidence of that in the papers at my website. We're distributing them across a lot of zones, but not nearly as many zones you could use in the United States. Census tracts, I think there's on the order of 43,000 census tracts. This is about 1/10, as many. So about 10 times the size of those. And we used multinomial logits for the business and personal trips with and without autonomous vehicles. So we just divvied all the trips up into those two big categories before we did the mode and destination choice models. There's a lot of zones, a lot of choices on a destination choice model. So I highly recommend you use strategic sampling, not just a simple sample of 30 or 10 or 300 choices, but you do a multinomial first without any thought of who makes it into your sample, and then you reweight all those destinations based on that initial logit to pick now more in concordance with how likely that zone would have been your choice. And you correct the logit function when you're maximizing the likelihood to get immediately efficient estimator. So maximally efficient, as good as you could do with the full data set, essentially. And then we did mode choice. Here in the United States, these are two of the biggies for the long distance trips, but airline doesn't become relevant until we're talking about 250 miles, well, 200 miles or more typically. And we've got revealed and stated preference data sets. We're splitting the trips up again into business versus non-business, and looking at revealed data versus the stated preference, because of course our interest here today is on the AV options. On the mode choice, we have to estimate, we have to assume that there's some price out there, and we're going forward to a year in the future. I don't know when it will be that everybody in the United States will have relatively easy access. Right now, you have access to AVs if you go to San Francisco or you go to Phoenix, and any day now you will be able to use that same app on your phone to get along an autonomous vehicle here in the Austin region, but those geofences are small. So it's Waymo that's here in Austin. We had Cruise for a while, and Waymo, of course, is selling rides on a standard app in San Francisco and Phoenix. And China has a lot of autonomous vehicles circulating as well. These vehicles will cost more in the long distance future, maybe about $3,500 more, but right now, $70,000 more. And some of our predictions suggest that almost half of the long distance trips in this country, those over 75 miles one way, would take place either in your own autonomous vehicle at that point or in a shared autonomous vehicle that you basically rent like a taxi. And when I say shared, I just mean that you don't own it. So it's like a shared bike. Only one person rides the bike at a time, but you don't own it. When your trip ends, it goes to somebody else. But of course, you can also share a ride in that vehicle. And so ride sharing is a really important part of all of the SAV research that my students do. Some people don't want to share rides. Some people are willing, maybe if it's daytime and it's not a very long distance trip, that kind of thing. And so we've got the human-driven ground vehicles plus the air travel, and then you can rent cars. That's pretty common. And then after autonomous vehicles, of course, you have, so the year 2040, let's say, you've got this other mode option, which is now dominating one-on-one against the other three modes there. The miles traveled is a really important variable to look at, and because we're making driving easier. So we're adding a mode or two and we're making it easier. If you decide to own it and keep it in your driveway, it will be easier, but you will pay a higher upfront cost, and then the use of the vehicle might be more expensive in certain ways. So you may not take it out as often, but of course your value of time burden has fallen. So in monetary terms, it may feel like it's a more expensive vehicle, but in time costs, it will be a less expensive vehicle probably overall for most people, depending on what they're willing to pay to save an hour of driving time. And so most vehicle, if that's the price, if that's the ownership price, and this is the use price, basically that's 61% ownership share across US households, which is pretty amazing, but not 100%. You'll need regulation to get it to 100%. And then the long distance passenger miles traveled, person miles traveled by any mode, going up by 24%. And this means doing about 300 miles a month per person rather than 250, which is the current average in this country. Air travel doesn't fall as much as I would think. So, our models don't see much of a dampening, but past models have really shown like devastation to the air markets in the short distance air origin destination pairs. Of course, going across the ocean and stuff, you can't take a car and going more than 500 miles is a really long boring car trip. So a lot of people still stick with air for those long trips. And yeah, the mode splits, were 79% prior to the private automobile and 18% in a rental car, 3% by airline. But using some of the assumptions I talked about earlier, and then also assuming that more people can use autonomous vehicles because they can be unlicensed or nervous about driving, like at night. A lot of elderly people do have their license in this country, but they will not drive to certain places. So assuming that, which is something that my friends at Carnegie Mellon estimated a while ago, and we applied it here, although I don't know that long distance trips are really going to see this kind of jump. I think short distance trips might see this kind of jump for new users who are unlicensed or don't own a vehicle. You might see that jump. So we applied it here, and the mode splits. Now we're only seeing 42% versus 79% in the private conventional automobile, and 10% in a conventional rental car versus 18%. And we're seeing, big shares in these two new modes, and air travel may be falling by about a sixth, so maybe 17% or something like that. The person miles traveled falling, so what does this really mean? Well, 170 to maybe 100 miles per capita per month for long distance trips. This is just long distance trips. And, the rental cars, the conventional rental cars falling by half, and autonomous vehicles capturing 83% of the new miles. Or it's not 83%, 83 new miles, and SAVs, kind of on par with that. So about almost a 50-50 split between, owning or renting, which is neat to see. But we do have other estimates, so they're not all quite like this. And I would love to hear any sugerencias o preguntas que ustedes tienen. Ahí, si quieren leer estos papeles, por favor, puedes poner Kugelman en el Google y usualmente llegarás a mi my internet site, my webpage. No sé cómo decir eso. So, questions?
Okay, Cara, thanks a lot for your wonderful presentation and this inspiring topic that we are all aware of what will happen in the future with this AB implementation. So we'll have a space for about 15 minutes for questions. So if you want to make your question, you can use the chat box or just raise the virtual hand to ask Cara. Okay, I will start with a icebreaker question. So I will just know if you in your models have safety concerns included in the AB implementation and in AB purchasing decision. So if you have considered that in your mode choice and in this buying this kind of technology.
Oh yeah, so I think we do ask them what concerns them, what attracts them to these kinds of vehicles, what concerns them about these vehicles, and a lot of times price, but safety for sure. And I think the safety one's going to be resolved pretty quickly because you're going to be seeing your friends coming home from exciting trips, or they really enjoyed their experience. And we see this maybe with electric vehicles, some people are worried like, well, will I get electrocuted if I charge my car, or could the battery like catch on fire? And so a lot of these things you see just play out naturally through a standard evolution. You've got your early adopters, and then the late adopters get to benefit from that experience. And I think we've already seen, if anybody's paying attention, that these vehicles are doing a lot less damage than my son and a lot of young men and other people out there. You know, a lot of us, you know, crash. I've crashed. I've crashed at low speed, but it was enough to destroy my vehicle because I crashed into a bigger vehicle. So it was very expensive and very sad. You know, I wasn't hurt in any way, but my son's been in 3 crashes as a young male, and you know, I guess probably 2 of those were his fault. 1 was his friend's fault. It's pretty awful. So I would love them to be going the speed limit or close to it, you know, and obeying the laws on our public roadways. If they want to drive like that, they need to pay somebody for that kind of access. So I think, you know, people will see the payoff, but we already do see it with Waymo, and we saw it with Cruise. Of course, a human driver pushed a pedestrian in front of a Cruise vehicle, which stopped really quickly in San Francisco, but the vehicle didn't realize there was a human trapped underneath it. And its next thought was, I got to get out of the way to let the cars behind me go. So it moved over and took that woman about 15 feet or something. And so I think a fair amount of damage was done to her during that move. And so that was very, very sad. And that is why Cruise was not allowed to continue in California at that point without somebody sitting in the front seat. So they put people back in the front seat, but they are not selling rides right now, as far as I know.
Okay, thanks, Juan de Dios. You are muted. You are muted, Juan de Dios.
Okay. Cara, I'm very interested in, I mean, I really wasn't able to follow the whole of your presentation because it was really big. Yeah? But you mentioned in the middle your population synthesizer or something like that. And I'm very interested in that because I think it's a crucial element in any of these potential uses of models for the future in any type of application. Did I understand correctly that you have developed a system that you can share?
Well, it's just a bunch of code. So we can't share the Polaris model, but we didn't use Polaris here, and we're being paid now, I think, to help our friends at Argonne National Lab use their model nationally. But yeah, it's just a bunch of equations, and all of the parameters are shown in the papers that we publish pretty much. But yeah, if there's anything missing, let me know. You can have it. And yeah, I think we could probably just share the Python code with you to apply a lot of these things. But when you load the network, which we didn't do because this was national network, and so the trips take hours, these long distance trips, so we're not loading and doing dynamic traffic assignment at that scale. But that is the hardest part of modeling, and that will generally cost you. Although Pedro Camargo, no sé de dónde es Pedro Camargo, pero está viviendo en Australia. He has a free model for all of us, which is really neat. That's probably going to compete with Transcat and some of these very expensive models.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 questions from Paola Racedo, and then we will have Jose Holguin with his virtual hand raised. So, Professor Cara, does the increasing use of automated vehicles for long distance bring challenges for transportation provider companies or governments? What will be these challenges? That's the first question from Paola.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the first challenges that we have seen here in this country is how do you license these vehicles? Because vehicles have to be licensed, not just the drivers. And traditionally, the language would say, you know, there needs to be a steering wheel, and like these things don't apply. And so some of the states have been much more aggressive about licensing the vehicles, like Nevada, because they'll do anything. Texas has been pretty, and then of course a lot of the technologists live in California, and so there's a lot of pressure to license there. But I think we're going to follow California's rulings on this. I think our National Highway Transportation Safety Administration is going to follow them on that, like what documentation has to be presented during crashes. So that was a big challenge, is just how do we allow them onto the roadways? And of course, another big challenge is overuse. We have a horrific climate crisis on our hands, and we really, need to be tightening our belts and relying less on these kinds of easy modes of transportation that consume a lot of energy. Even if it's an all-electric vehicle, they are heavy, and the batteries take so much energy to create that my Tesla Model 3, which is the least expensive, shortest range Tesla, it will still have a life cycle impact that's about half of the comparable vehicle. And so, these EVs are not going to save us. It doesn't matter if all these things are electric, which they probably will be, because they have so much power consuming equipment on board, that they will likely be electric drivetrains, hopefully wholly electric drivetrains, but it's still, even coupled with almost 100% renewables in the grid, that's going to be an issue for the climate and, of course, the congestion. And so I always tell people, do not allow private autonomous vehicles to drive empty, and make sure that your fleets are less than 20% empty driving. So that's it, 20% max. If I gave each one of you an AV, you might get rid of your other cars, and that AV might be 50% empty, driving around to serve you and your family members all day long. So that's what people are thinking. That's what they're going to do. No way. 0% driving empty by privately owned autonomous vehicles, only fleet owned, and they have to stay under 20% empty. So that's going to be key. So even if we have that rule in place, I think you still need road pricing. You absolutely need it, and that it should be credit based. So because TxDOT or whoever is in charge of the roads, they're not spending any money to manage, I guess with congestion, I'm the one in getting that cost. So are the people behind me. They're all experience that cost directly. TxDOT is not experiencing that cost. And so that money just goes back and allows people to rent electric bikes or, get on the bus for free all month long. And so the people who really want the roadways are basically paying the other people to stay off through credit-based congestion pricing. So those are some of the policy recommendations I have. Follow California. You keep the fleets at under 20% empty, and all of us private AV owners at 0% empty. And then, of course, you need road pricing. And these are smart cars. They know exactly where they are. But I think safety is going to be a good outcome of this.
Okay, great, Kara. I think we will move to the next question from Jose. Jose.
Cara, muy interesante tu presentación. Yo sé que tú no discutiste los resultados para el transporte de carga. ¿Tú podrías hacer una comparación de lo que tú esperarías en transporte de carga versus los efectos de pasajeros?
Bueno, yo creo que habrá un operador o operadora, porque es una inversión muy grande, es un asset gigante, ¿no? Y costoso, pero esa persona puede estar escribiendo un libro o haciendo cosas administrativas y durmiendo durante. Entonces, en nuestros simulaciones estamos pensando que pueden seguir manejando o manejándose, pero yo creo que habrá una operadora, porque cuando llegan para darles la carga o recibir la carga es buena idea. Y también si yo choco con ellos, es importante tener a alguien ahí dormida o no sé, pero alguien para ayudar con ese choque. Y otras cosas, pero al inicio y al fin de ese viaje y también durante el viaje por razones de, no sé, una llanta que se explota o explota.
Claro, sí.
Yeah. ¿Qué crees tú, José?
Bueno, ¿qué creo yo? Yo creo que la industria de transporte de carga es muy heterogénea. Entonces, las compañías que pueden pagar por vehículos autónomos o semiautónomos son básicamente las compañías que están en el tope de la pirámide. El estimado mío es que esas compañías, estamos hablando FedEx, DHL, I mean, all this, all the companies that we recognize, all of them may own or operate maybe 500,000 trucks. But in the US, there are almost 15 million. You see, 15 million. Eso es una cantidad, es 15 millones. Entonces, lo que me indica a mí es que va a haber como digo, esos vehículos van a ser adoptados para las compañías más grandes, pero el resto van a quedar con los camiones viejos, porque ellos no pueden ni siquiera mantener los camiones que tienen. Y yo creo que eso sería una cosa para un segmento pequeño de la industria. Y quizás décadas en el futuro, cuando esos camiones estén depreciados y los vendan a los camioneros más pobres, que le lleguen a ellos, pero estamos hablando de 30, 40 años.
Como
Eso es lo que
dije,
yo pienso.
tú sabes mucho mejor que yo cuál es la vida ahora de una máquina. Yo creo que quitan the engine y lo reemplazan y mantienen el carro por la troca, el camión. Yeah. So I don't know how long these things last, but I do think, that secondhand market is really important, and that the early investments like in Tesla, that they started with very expensive cars, those prices come down and others enter the
Sí.
market. Aurora, is doing great. I don't know, Tesla could be a real surprise for us. I could go back into heavy duty truck.
El segundo mercado es importante porque las compañías grandes, ellos, el promedio de edad de los camiones es cerca de 4 años. En 4 años ellos venden los camiones.
Oh, venden, pero siguen viviendo aquí en los Estados Unidos. Ya, tenemos eso también, que hay mucha gente que solo quiere el carro nuevito y se vende dentro de 2 o 4 años, ya.
Sí,
Pero sigue registrado por otra familia, por ejemplo.
claro, claro. Ok, muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Una pregunta en español. Perfecto.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. So I would like to offer both of you, Juan de Dios and Cara, a virtual round of applause for your inspiring presentations. Thank you all very much for participating in this webinar series. I think very soon the committee will be announcing the next webinars. So very happy to have shared this time with you and learn a lot of new things from autonomous vehicles, but also from the heuristics and the new things that are working from the Juan de Dios side. So thank you very much to all participants and for our presenters.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys. We lost Juan de Dios. Julián, ¿no tienes preguntas para mí? Alberto, Víctor.
I have one at the very beginning, but I was just curious about the drop in rental cars, and if you expect the drop in rental car share in terms and not for the air, because I was expecting more like a higher drop in the air trips, but not only in the rental cars.
Yeah, so you're still renting a car when it's an SAV. So I think Hertz and these other rental car agencies will still be in business. They have to partner with whoever that provider is. So they'll be a big buyer, for the long distance trips. But some people just want a short trip, like a little Waymo trip, and Waymo may want to just partner with